The speech of Ibrahim Traoré, directed to Black Americans, has been described as one of the most powerful and unfiltered messages delivered by an African leader in decades. It was not a polished diplomatic statement meant for the approval of Western elites, nor was it a speech designed to win applause in international forums. Instead, it was raw, unrestrained, and deeply rooted in history, pain, and pride. In this message, Traoré sought to establish a bridge across the Atlantic, reminding Black Americans that their destinies are tied to Africa, not merely as a concept of heritage, but as a living reality that continues to define global struggles for justice, freedom, and dignity. From the very beginning, his tone captured attention. He addressed the audience not as foreigners or distant relatives, but as brothers and sisters who had been violently separated from their ancestral home. He did not shy away from naming the painful truth. The transatlantic slave trade was one of the most brutal crimes in human history, carried out by powers that still dominate global economics and politics today. He reminded them that millions of Africans were stolen from their homelands, forced into slavery in the Americas, and cut off from their cultures and languages. Yet their survival and resistance became the foundation of Black identity in the New World. His words carried both sorrow and defiance. He acknowledged the centuries of oppression Black Americans have endured, from slavery to Jim Crow laws, from segregation to systemic racism that persists today. But instead of framing them only as victims, Traoré celebrated their resilience, their ability to transform suffering into creativity, culture, and revolutionary struggle. He spoke of Black intellectuals, artists, and leaders who have shaped global consciousness, from W.E.B. Du Bois and Malcolm X to Maya Angelou, Martin Luther King Jr., and countless others. Their battles, he said, were never just about civil rights within America, but part of the wider liberation of African people worldwide. At the same time, Traoré reminded his audience that while Black Americans had been fighting for recognition and justice in the United States, Africa itself had also been struggling against colonial domination, exploitation, and neo-colonial control. He drew a clear connection. The same empires that enslaved Africans were the ones that colonized the continent, stripping it of its resources and sovereignty. And today, those same powers continue their exploitation through economic control, debt traps, and military interventions disguised as peacekeeping. This was where his message grew sharper and more direct. He called on Black Americans to see beyond the illusions presented to them by mainstream Western narratives. He urged them to recognize that Africa is not a poor, hopeless land, as it is often portrayed, but a continent of immense wealth, young energy, and untapped potential. Its gold, diamonds, oil, fertile lands, and strategic position are the very reasons why foreign powers fight so hard to keep Africa weak and divided. Traoré insisted that the liberation of Africa is not just about Africans living on the continent, it is about Black people everywhere. He reminded them of the vision of Pan-Africanists like Kwame Nkrumah, Marcus Garvey, and Thomas Sankara, who understood that the freedom of Black people in America and the freedom of Africa are two sides of the same coin. He quoted the famous words, "The destiny of the African diaspora is inseparable from the destiny of Africa itself." According to him, the struggles against racial injustice in the United States cannot be fully resolved until Africa itself stands free, sovereign, and respected on the world stage. Traoré did not hesitate to critique the systems of global power that perpetuate inequality. He pointed to the role of the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, and multinational corporations that continue to extract wealth from African nations, often with the silent approval of governments in the West. He argued that the exploitation of Africa's natural wealth is directly linked to the struggles of Black Americans, because the same global order that denies Africa development also sustains racial and economic injustice abroad. One of the most striking parts of his message was his call for unity across the diaspora. He told Black Americans that they are not outsiders to Africa, but part of its living soul. He invited them to look at Africa not through the lens of poverty and instability, but as a homeland that is rising again, reclaiming its dignity and reshaping its destiny. He acknowledged that not every Black American would wish to move to Africa, nor is such a return necessary for solidarity. But he urged them to reconnect culturally, politically, and economically, to see Africa as their partner in struggle, and to contribute to its transformation. He spoke about the importance of building bridges between African Americans and African nations in practical ways. This included investments in African industries, collaborations in technology, education, and agriculture, and cultural exchanges that strengthen the bonds between communities across continents. He emphasized that unity is not symbolic. It must be material, built through action and mutual support. Traoré also addressed the psychological and spiritual dimensions of this relationship. He spoke of how colonialism and slavery sought to erase the pride of Black identity, replacing it with inferiority complexes and divisions. For too long, both Africans and their diaspora have been conditioned to look to the West for approval, validation, and direction. He declared that this mentality must end. "We are not beggars at the table of those who enslaved us," he said. "We are the builders of our own future, and that future begins when we stand together." His words resonated strongly when he touched on the youth. He reminded Black Americans that Africa is the youngest continent in the world, with a population brimming with creativity and ambition. At the same time, the younger generation of Black Americans continues to fight against systemic oppression in the United States. By linking these two forces, the rising energy of African youth and the enduring resistance of Black Americans, Traoré painted a vision of a global movement that could challenge the dominance of oppressive systems worldwide. The message also carried warnings. He cautioned that the struggle will not be easy because global powers will use every tactic, from propaganda and economic sabotage to coups and assassinations, to prevent African unity. He pointed to the history of African leaders like Patrice Lumumba, Thomas Sankara, and Muammar Gaddafi, who were eliminated because they dared to challenge global powers and call for African independence. He reminded Black Americans that the same forces that work to suppress movements like Black Lives Matter are connected to those that destabilize African nations. The system of oppression is global, and therefore resistance must also be global. At several moments, Traoré's tone grew deeply personal. He spoke as a young African leader himself, one who has faced threats, assassination attempts, and immense pressure from global powers. Yet he declared that he would not be silenced, because the future of Africa and its diaspora is too important to be left in the hands of those who profit from division. He told Black Americans that their support, solidarity, and engagement are not just welcome, but vital for the survival of Africa's struggle for independence. He reminded them of the cultural power they already hold. Through music, sports, fashion, and media, Black Americans shape global culture in ways that few other communities can. He urged them to use that influence not just for entertainment or profit, but as a tool of liberation, connecting their cultural power with Africa's political and economic struggles. He said that when Africa rises, the image and dignity of Black people worldwide rise with it. Traoré concluded his message not with despair, but with hope. He declared that despite centuries of slavery, colonization, and oppression, the African spirit has never been broken. The very fact that Africans and their descendants survive and thrive across the world is proof of resilience and greatness. He called on Black Americans to remember that their roots are in the same soil that nurtured ancient civilizations, from Egypt to Mali, from Ethiopia to the kingdoms of West Africa. That legacy, he said, cannot be erased. He ended with a vision, a future where Africans and Black Americans walk side by side, no longer as scattered victims of history, but as united architects of a new global order. A future where Africa's wealth is no longer stolen, but used to empower its people and their diaspora. A future where the Black child in Chicago, Lagos, Kingston, and Dakar all share the same pride in their identity, knowing they belong to a people who have overcome the greatest trials of history. The applause and reactions to Traoré's message made it clear that he had touched a deep chord. For some it was a call to action, for others it was a reminder of their roots. But for all, it was a statement that the struggle for freedom and dignity is far from over, and that only by uniting across continents can Black people achieve the justice and respect they deserve. His words were not just political rhetoric. They were a torch passed from one generation to another, from one side of the Atlantic to the other. It was a reminder that no matter the distance, no matter the centuries, the bond between Africa and its diaspora is alive, and in the hands of leaders like Ibrahim Traoré, it burns brighter than ever.